Marie had never considered herself naive. She understood the world well enough, had seen its dark corners during her 12 years of marriage to Tom, but nothing had quite prepared her for the evening Tom casually mentioned his fantasy over dinner, as if discussing holiday plans or a new movie release. They sat across from each other at their old wooden dining table, a space usually filled with chatter about work or the mundane details of domestic life. That night Tom's voice was unusually steady, his eyes avoiding hers as he articulated his desire to see her with other men, 3 to be specific. The food in her mouth turned to ash. She couldn't swallow. Is this a joke? She wanted to laugh it off, but the earnest look on his face stopped her. He wasn't laughing. Tom explained how he imagined it, his words washing over her in a surreal tide. Marie felt a mixture of disbelief and a strange hollow fear as he described each detail with a precision that suggested long contemplation. It wasn't just a passing thought. This was a deep-seated fantasy, one he now wanted to bring to life. Marie listened, her dinner untouched, growing cold as the evening light faded. She searched Tom's face for signs of the man she married, the gentle soul who blushed when he first confessed his love for her, who had always respected her above all. This conversation felt like a breach of everything she held sacred about their relationship, yet there was a part of her that trembled at the thought of outright refusal. Could she deny him this if it was what he truly wanted? The weight of her wedding ring felt oppressive, a band of gold that suddenly symbolized a chain rather than a bond. Why me? Why this? She asked, her voice a mix of anger and vulnerability. Tom reached across the table, taking her hand. He spoke of boredom, of spicing things up, of seeing her as an object of desire not only for him but for others. His honesty was brutal, and his rationale seemed to strip her of her individuality, reducing her to a mere player in his script. That night, after Tom had laid out his entire vision, leaving nothing obscured, Marie lay in bed next to him, her body turned away, staring at the shadows dancing on the wall from the streetlights outside. Her mind raced through a spectrum of emotions, shock, anger, sadness, and an unexpected flicker of curiosity. What would it be like to be so wanted, to cross a line so bold? These thoughts scared her more than the proposal itself. The days that followed were a blur of internal conflict. Marie juggled the dichotomy of her desires to satisfy Tom and to uphold her own moral and emotional boundaries. Her heart felt like a pendulum, swinging between revulsion and a deep, unspoken thrill. The more she thought about it, the more she realized this could be a turning point in their marriage. It could either open a Pandora's box of future complications, or rekindle a flame that had been waning for years. After many sleepless nights, Marie approached Tom with her decision. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "I'll do it," she said, her heart sinking as she watched his face light up with an excitement that stung her more than she expected. "But remember, this was your choice. We can't undo this once it's done." Marie's agreement was reluctant, forged from a complex web of love, fear, and the haunting question of what happens if she said no. As she watched Tom's eager nod, she felt a part of her retreat into a shell, bracing for the unknown, wondering if the fulfillment of Tom's fantasy would eventually lead to the unravelling of everything she had once cherished in their marriage. Marie found herself in the kitchen, pacing back and forth, the cool tiles doing little to soothe the heat rising in her cheeks. Tom was on the phone in the next room, his voice low and conspiratorial as he spoke with someone about the arrangements. Every now and then his laughter, a sound she had once adored, now sent a shiver of dread through her. It was decided. The day was set. Tomorrow their quiet suburban home would transform into the stage of Tom's fantasies. As she moved around the house, adjusting cushions that didn't need adjusting, dusting shelves that were already clean, Marie's mind raced with thoughts of the impending event. She remembered the early days, filled with tender glances and stolen kisses. How had they gone from loving whispers to hushed negotiations with strangers? The home they had built together, once a sanctuary, now felt more like a looming battleground. That night, as they lay in bed, the space between them felt charged with an electric tension. Tom seemed energized, almost buoyant with anticipation. He talked about the excitement, the adventure of it, as if they were planning a vacation, not inviting strangers into their marital bed. His words felt foreign, as if he were speaking another language, one laced with desires she could scarcely recognize, let alone share. Marie turned away, her gaze fixed on the moonlight spilling across the bed. She tried to find comfort in the familiar softness of their sheets, but they offered no solace. Her mind was a whirlpool of fears and doubts. What if she couldn't go through with it? What if she did, and it changed everything? The what-ifs were endless, each more tormenting than the last. As dawn crept through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor, Marie rose from the bed. She moved quietly through the house, each step measured and heavy. In the solitude of the kitchen, she brewed coffee, the rich aroma filling the air, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within her. With each sip, she tried to steel herself against the day, to fortify her resolve to see this through for Tom, for their marriage, perhaps even for herself. Throughout the day, Tom was a blur of activity, making phone calls, checking texts, and smiling in a way that seemed both secretive and pleased. Marie watched him, her heart sinking with each passing hour. By evening, as the sky painted itself in hues of orange and purple, the reality of what was to come settled heavy on her shoulders. She cooked dinner, the clinking of the utensils against the pots and pans punctuating the silence between them. Later, standing at the window, Marie watched as the sun dipped below the horizon, the daylight fading as quickly as her resolve. In the darkness of their room, she dressed carefully, her hands trembling as she buttoned her blouse, each button a reminder of the line they were about to cross. In the mirror, she searched her reflection for signs of the woman she used to be, the woman who would have laughed at such a ludicrous proposition, who would have turned away without a second thought. But tonight she was no longer that woman. Tonight she was the key player in a script written by someone else, her own desires and fears relegated to the wings as the main act prepared to take centre stage. As she turned from the mirror, a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach, the weight of the impending night bearing down on her, relentless and unyielding. The doorbell echoed through the corridors of the home, a stark, foreboding sound that made Marie's heart skip. She glanced at Tom, his eager nod pushing her toward the door. With a deep, steadying breath, she pulled it open. The three men introduced themselves with smiles that tried to mask the underlying tension of the situation. Their eyes briefly lingered on Marie, courteous yet appraising. Tom stepped forward, his demeanour bright and welcoming. "Glad you could make it," he said, clapping one of the men on the back with a familiarity that belied the true nature of their meeting. He led them into the living room, gesturing for everyone to sit. The men took their places on the couch, their postures casually open, yet each movement seemed measured, cautious. Marie offered drinks, her hands barely trembling as she poured the wine. The clink of glass against glass sounded unusually loud in the room. Conversation stumbled into a stilted rhythm, with Tom doing most of the talking. He recounted a humorous anecdote from work, laughter filling the room, seeming almost too loud, too forced. The men joined in, their laughter mingling with Tom's. creating a semblance of normalcy. As the evening wore on, the initial awkwardness began to dissipate, smoothed over by Tom's efforts to normalize the situation. He was the perfect host, his words flowing easily, but every so often his eyes would catch Marie's, an unspoken question lingering in his gaze. Was she okay? Could she go through with this? Her slight nod was all he needed to continue. Marie sat quietly, mostly listening, interjecting with a comment or a nod where appropriate. The men were polite, engaging in the conversation with interest, occasionally directing questions at her, testing the waters of her comfort with their presence. Their respectfulness did little to ease her discomfort, but it provided a thin veneer of civility to the evening. As the wine flowed, the room grew warmer, the atmosphere thickening with unspoken anticipations. Tom's voice grew more animated, his stories more vivid, his laughter a bit too enthusiastic. He was playing his role with a fervour that both impressed and saddened Marie. This was the man she loved, always able to command a room, now using his charisma to orchestrate her deepest anxieties into reality. The clock ticked louder, each stroke slicing through the haze of forced conviviality. Marie excused herself to refresh the snacks, lingering in the kitchen longer than necessary. She leaned against the counter, the cool marble beneath her palms, grounding her swirling thoughts. She was here, in this moment, because she chose to be, she reminded herself. Yet the choice felt like a chain around her neck, heavy and cold. Returning to the living room, she found the men more relaxed, their bodies angled towards each other, the conversation flowing more freely. Tom caught her eye, his smile wide, inviting her back into the fold. She rejoined them, her smile painted on, her heart racing. This was it. The evening was in full swing, and there was no turning back now. Tom's hand found hers, giving it a reassuring squeeze. She squeezed back, her resolve solidifying with the contact. Whatever happened tonight, they would face it together for better or worse. The room fell into a charged silence as Tom stood and announced it was time to move to a more comfortable setting. The shift was almost palpable, the air thick with anticipation and something darker, an undercurrent of the unknown. The men rose, their movements deliberate, their eyes locked on Marie with a new intensity that made her stomach tighten. Marie followed, her steps mechanical, as if her body knew to move even when her mind screamed to retreat. The lighting in the room softened, shadows playing over faces, transforming familiar features into something more ominous, more unknown. Tom stayed close, his hand brushing hers, a lifeline amidst the swelling sea of her panic. The conversation shifted, words becoming whispers, laughs turning to low murmurs. One of the men stepped closer, his presence towering, his heat radiating. He spoke softly, his voice a velvet caress that contrasted sharply with the hard glint in his eye. Marie nodded, her responses automatic, her mind detached as if watching from afar. Tom watched, his expression a mask of excitement shadowed by doubt. He had imagined this moment, played it over in his mind 1,000 times, but reality was a harsher light, casting long dark shadows across his thoughts. He saw Marie, her smile tight, her eyes darting to him for reassurance. He gave it willingly, nodding encouragement, yet each nod chipped away at the facade of his confidence. As the evening progressed, the boundaries they had once held sacred blurred into obscurity. Touches lingered longer, words dipped in innuendo, each glance loaded with promise and threat. Marie found herself caught in a dance she didn't know the steps to, each move leading her further from her comfort zone, deeper into the territory that Tom had charted out so eagerly. One of the men laughed, a sound that once would have seemed friendly but now felt like a prelude to something else. He moved closer, his intentions clear in the slow reach of his hand towards her. Marie stiffened, her breath caught in her throat, her eyes flicking to Tom, searching for what? Approval? Intervention? But Tom only watched, his gaze intense, his lips parted in a silent cheer. The touch, when it came, was light but firm, undeniable. Marie's skin crawled under the contact, her heart pounding loud in her ears. She looked down, watching as if detached from her own body, as his hand traced the line of her arm, up her shoulder, pausing at the nape of her neck. The room seemed to contract, the walls inching closer, her breaths shorter. Tom's voice broke through her fog, his tone light, joking, as if they were at a normal party, not on the precipice of this cliff. "Isn't she beautiful?" he asked the room, pride swelling in his words. The men agreed, their eyes alight with a glow that felt too intense, too hungry. Marie pulled back slightly, reclaiming a sliver of space, of self. She forced a laugh, echoing Tom's ease, her voice a hollow sound in her own ears. The evening had taken on a momentum of its own, rolling forward with or without her consent. Tom's dream was unfolding around her, and as she met his eyes across the room, she saw a flicker of something else in his gaze. Was it regret? Or merely the reflection of her own turmoil staring back at her? The air felt electric, charged with unspoken expectations as they crossed the final boundary. The world seemed to pause, holding its breath as Marie felt the last threads of the familiar unravel. The moment was stark, an irrevocable crossing into a domain from which there was no retreat. Each touch, each whispered word felt like an echo in a vast empty hall, resonating deeper within her. Tom's eyes were on her, wide with a mix of awe and something darker, maybe realization. The lines they had crossed blurred into oblivion, leaving behind a new, uncharted map of their relationship. Marie's own gaze was fixed, lost in the rapid current of the moment, carried away by the rush of actions and reactions that seemed to belong to someone else, someone she hardly knew. The intensity peaked, the room spinning around her, voices mingling into a distant, indistinct murmur. There was a crescendo, a physical and emotional summit that broke over her like a wave, leaving her gasping, her mind scrambling to grasp the threads of who she was before and who she might become after. The realization hit hard, the weight of the event crashing down on her, a heavy cloak that threatened to smother. When it was over, the silence was deafening. The three men, now strangers again, collected themselves with nods and murmurs, a clumsy reassembling of normalcy. They left with a quietude that belied the storm that had just passed. The door clicked shut, a soft finale to the cacophony of the night. Tom stood there, the aftermath written across his face in lines of confusion and concern. He approached Marie, his movements hesitant, as if he were approaching a wild animal, unsure if it was tamed. His voice, when he spoke, was soft, filled with something like regret. "Marie, are you all right?" His question hung between them, a thin thread in the vast space. Marie turned to him, her expression unreadable, her eyes clouded with a tumult of emotions. She moved past him, her steps slow, deliberate, each one a statement of her disarray. She needed space, air to breathe, away from the stifling atmosphere of the room that had witnessed too much. In the sanctuary of the bathroom, she leaned against the cool tile, the chill a balm to her fevered skin. The mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized, her face a pale mask of the night's trials. The water ran in the sink, a soothing sound against the storm of her thoughts. She splashed her face, the droplets a baptism, a hopeful washing away of the night's sins. Tom's voice came through the door, muffled but persistent. "Marie, talk to me, please." His plea was a tether pulling at her, reminding her of what was still tied to the other side. She knew they would have to speak, to unravel the night's knots, to see if the fabric of their marriage could hold, or if it had frayed beyond repair. But not yet, not now. Now was for silence, for solitude, for the beginning of understanding the full depth of what had transpired. Morning light crept in, unwelcome and too bright. Marie lay awake, the echoes of the night reverberating in her mind, a relentless tide washing over the remnants of sleep. She turned to find Tom still asleep, his face relaxed, a stark contrast to the turmoil in her own heart. The distance between them in the bed felt like miles, each inch a story of what had transpired, each silence a word unspoken. She rose quietly, the floor cold under her feet, a reminder of the reality she now faced. The house was silent. The normal sounds of their daily routine paused as if the walls themselves held their breath, waiting for what would come next. Marie made coffee, the familiar ritual momentarily grounding her swirling thoughts. Tom eventually appeared, his footsteps hesitant as he entered the kitchen. He paused at the doorway, his usual morning greeting caught in his throat. His eyes searched hers, looking for a sign, a clue to her state of mind. Marie handed him a cup, her hands steady, her face an emotionless mask. The first words were his, a tentative, "How are you feeling?" That sounded more like an apology. Marie looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the man she had loved, the man who had asked her to cross lines she never thought she would approach. "How do you think I feel, Tom?" Her voice was calm, but her eyes were hard, challenging. The conversation that followed was a slow unravelling of the night before. Tom tried to explain, to justify his words, a mix of regret and defensiveness. It was just supposed to be a fantasy, something different, exciting, but as he spoke, he seemed to realize with each word how hollow it sounded, how inadequate. Marie listened, a growing coldness settling in her chest. "Different for whom, Tom? Exciting for whom?" Her questions pierced the morning calm, sharp and clear. She spoke of boundaries, of trust, of respect, questioning the very foundations of their marriage. What was it all for? Who were they to each other now? Tom had no answers that could satisfy, no words that could bridge the gap that had widened between them. He reached for her hand, a gesture that once would have comforted, but now felt like too little, too late. Marie pulled away gently but firmly. "We can't just go back, Tom. Not after last night." The decision hung in the air, heavy and final. Marie spoke of needing space, of needing time to think, to understand if the love that had bound them could survive the storm they had weathered. Tom nodded, his face crumpling, a mix of understanding and despair. He knew she was right, knew that this was not a simple wound to heal with apologies or promises. Marie left the room, her steps slow but determined. She paused at the door, looking back at the man she had shared so much with, the man who had changed the course of their lives with a single, selfish desire. "I need to find out who I am now, Tom, without you, and you need to think about what you've really lost." The door closed softly behind her, leaving Tom alone in the kitchen, the silence a heavy cloak around him. The future was uncertain, the path unclear, but the first steps had been taken. For Marie, it was a path toward rediscovery, toward reclaiming the parts of herself lost in the shadows of her marriage. For Tom, it was a realization of the cost of his desires, a reckoning with the consequences of crossing lines that should have never been approached. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, Marie felt a slow reclamation of her sense of self. The solitude she had chosen was not just a space away from Tom, but a sanctuary where she could listen to her own voice, long muffled by the din of her marriage. She filled her days with small, simple tasks and long walks in the nearby park, each step a meditation on her path forward. She took up painting again, a hobby she had set aside in the early years of her marriage. The brush strokes on the canvas were expressions of her inner turmoil and her deep longing for peace. Colours bled into each other, blues merging into blacks, reds into oranges, each canvas a sunset of her old life, each new one a sunrise of her future. Marie also began attending a weekly support group. At first she was a silent observer, listening to stories that echoed her own, stories of trust broken and boundaries violated. But as weeks passed, she found her voice among the others, her story pouring out in a cathartic rush that left her lighter, more buoyant. The group, a collection of strangers, became her confidants, their shared experiences a bridge that connected her isolated island to the mainland of humanity. In these sessions, Marie realized the power of shared pain and the healing that came from speaking the unspeakable. She learned, too, about forgiveness, not just the possibility of forgiving Tom, but the deeper, more critical need to forgive herself. She had stepped into the unknown out of love, a misguided step perhaps, but one that needed reconciliation within her own heart. Marie also sought professional help. The therapist's office was a place of reflection where she unpacked the layers of her marriage, examining each year, each decision that had led her to that fateful night. It was here that she came to understand the dynamics of control and freedom, and how she had allowed one to overshadow the other. The therapy was not about assigning blame, it was about understanding, about finding a way to live with the choices she had made, and about learning to make better ones in the future. As months unfolded, Marie found herself stronger, more centered. She made the decision to file for divorce, not out of spite or anger, but out of a newfound respect for her own worth and a clear understanding of her needs. It was a difficult decision, one that came with its own set of challenges, but she faced them with a resilience that surprised even her. The final reflection came as Marie stood once again in front of a canvas, her palette full of vibrant colours. She painted a wide, open landscape, a path winding through it, stretching towards a horizon bathed in light. It was a visual metaphor for her journey, a representation of her journey from shadow into light. Marie knew the road ahead would have its own set of challenges, but she felt prepared, armed with a deeper understanding of herself and a commitment to living her truth. The lessons of the past were etched into her being, not as scars but as guideposts for the future. She had emerged not just surviving but thriving, ready to face whatever came next with an open heart and an unshakable spirit.